Sorry, let's just make sure that I am then able to see everybody and presenting at the same time. Okay. So thanks. James has largely introduced me. I'll just give a very brief moment to SRK, and then we'll dive right into the requirements. The idea of today is to just give everybody an overview. If I'm preaching to the choir, I'm really sorry, but it was very difficult to judge quite what the knowledge was out there. So I'll just go through the local requirements, the lender standards, and the financial disclosure standards, because those two are very strongly linked. One slide on a how-to guide, because that's almost an intro to how we've then structured this webinar series, and the more information on how to address this kind of climate change issue will be provided through the rest of the webinars. Then Q&A, as James said, and close. So James has already introduced me. I think the only point to be made here is I haven't been in climate change solely for my entire career. I started out working for a planning company. I've done my fair share of environmental impact assessments, and that's kind of why the adaptation side of climate change appealed to me. So yeah, just so that you guys know the context from which I'm coming from. I think if you're an SAIMM member, you probably know SRK really well. What you may not know is the extent of our environmental and social services. So the climate change team is one of those, what would be considered environmental services, although we are working very closely with our mine design guys as well as the NGO guys that do the tailings management and design. So I'm sure that you know a few of them. Okay, so launching straight into it. To start with, we'll cover a little bit of the local requirements. In terms of the local requirements, in terms of the requirements, we'll cover the local legislation as well as a bit of international best practice, and that will talk to lender standards and to the disclosure requirements, because those are the guidelines that the lenders most commonly use. Okay. So, local legislation. The first thing to note is that the JSE does in fact have climate disclosure guidance. It was prepared in 2022, and it is aligned to the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It does, however, acknowledge reference to the ISSB, and I'll get more into those in a little bit. We do also have a Climate Change Act, and the Act talks to mitigation, which the lenders refer to as transitional risk, and adaptation, which the lenders refer to as physical risks. And I'll go through those a little bit more detail as we progress. It doesn't specify a requirement, for instance, if you're doing an EIA. So there's not a very distinct set of rules. So there are the EIA regulations, and under that, DFFE as well as EDTIA, which is the KZN department, have published draft guidelines. There may be other provinces that have published draft guidelines, but at this point I wasn't aware of them. And then it is important to note that DFFE put those draft climate change guidelines out for comment towards the end of last year. So I think they are getting ready to make those less draft and more of a requirement. So we will have a little bit more concrete guidance. And then the Carbon Tax Act, I'm sure you guys are aware of that, but that's been in force for some time. And then linked to that, the national greenhouse gas emission reporting regulations. And a newer one on the block, and possibly a bigger concern, is the draft greenhouse gas carbon budget regulations. And those are a little more concerning because while government will give industries, in this case specifically mines, the opportunity to draft a carbon budget with practical or realistic reductions, the regulations are written in such a way that the authority isn't required to necessarily accept those plans. They can set more stringent carbon reduction as part of this law. So watch this space. It's not yet finalized, but I do imagine that that is going to need a bit of attention in the coming years because, yeah, you will effectively have the opportunity to offer a reduction, and then the authority will decide whether they accept that or whether they want to make it more stringent. Okay, so that's kind of in a nutshell what local legislation has to say around climate change. Then I'll go through very briefly the lender requirements. I have focused on these three. There may be others, but these are the three that are most common, and I think most of the mines look at. So for the Equator Principles, they focus very heavily on climate change risk, but they do specify that you should assess climate change risk in terms of the TCFD. So they do look at both transitional and physical risk, but their limit for having to quantify greenhouse gases is quite high. It's at 100,000 tons annually. They do also require or recommend that you report in terms of the greenhouse gas protocol. So there is quite a lot of guidance in that lender standard. Then the International Finance Corporation, the IFC, they have Performance Standards 3, which is resource sufficiency, and they require that projects with 25,000 tons of CO2 annually quantify the direct emissions. So those are scope 1 and 2. That basically means emissions that result from your facility or from the use of energy. So they don't specifically talk about climate adaptation, but they do also reference the TCFD. You'll see where I'm going with this. And they note that would be the way, that would be a recommendation of how to proceed with this impact assessment. Okay. So then finally, the African Development Bank, they are completely focused on adaptation. So they look at community health, safety, and security and indicate that you must consider design, or you must consider climate change when you do design. Then the Safeguard 6 requires that you consider climatic changes when you're considering threats to biodiversity. So you can see, even across the lenders, their approach to these different components of climate change are very different. And each one of them focuses on a different aspect. Okay. So because most of the lenders refer to the TCFD and the Joburg Stock Exchange, as well as most of the global stock exchanges, historically referred to the TCFD. So that's the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Core elements of the TCFD look at or ask the organization to describe how they govern climate-related risks and opportunities. They ask that they build strategy around actual or potential impacts and opportunities, so that can inform the organization's business, their strategy, and their financial planning, which is quite an important one. It requires them to consider climate change in their risk management processes. So just most of the mines have a site-based risk assessment, and SRK certainly has assisted many mines in building climate change into that risk assessment and doing assessments in terms of those methodologies. So we won't necessarily go through that today, but that is a focus of one of the later webinars, which I'll have chat to you about shortly. And then it asks that organizations have metrics and targets associated with climate risks. I'm going to just go through to the IFRS. I need to be able to read out the acronyms. You'll notice there's a lot of acronyms. This is an environmental thing, I've realized, not just a climate change thing. But the IFRS is the International Financial Reporting Standards. And the ISSB is the International Sustainability Standards Board. So effectively, in October 2023, the TCFD completed its mandate, and because it had done what it needed to do, it was dissolved. While it has been dissolved, most lenders and even some corporate stage gate processes still refer to the TCFD because it established a very robust way to assess climate risks. But at this point, the Financial Services Board requested IFRS, International Finance Reporting Standards, to assume responsibility for overseeing companies in terms of their climate-related disclosures. So this really talks to your shareholders. Your shareholders want to be able to invest knowing that you have taken the risk of climate change into account. And this provides a standard against which they can then make informed decisions. So from June 2023, the IFRS created a new disclosure standard, S2. So S1 is general sustainability. S2 is specifically related to climate disclosures, and it has been issued by the SSB. So its objective is really to require businesses to disclose information about their climate risks and opportunities so that individuals or organizations that are either considering investing or providing resources, so lenders or shareholders, can make informed decisions around the risk associated with, for instance, a mine. Okay, so to the most important point, and I know I alluded to this, but I couldn't decide whether to put this up front or whether to put it at the end, because the most important thing to know is that there are differences between the TCFD and the IFRS standard. The IFRS is consistent with the TCFD in terms of breaking climate change down into two very distinct components. But while TCFD was more broad and voluntary, the IFRS is more stringent. It has a very concrete set of requirements and talks about integrating those requirements with your sustainability reporting. Okay, so while the TCFD is referenced in lender standards to a large extent, so if you comply with the IFRS, you will comply with the TCFD, but not necessarily the other way around. But the lender standards all refer to the TCFD. Okay. What these two, though, have in common is this distinction between the two components of climate change. So they refer to transitional risks, and this is what legislation or general climate change speak refers to mitigation. And this is your impact effectively on the environment. So transitional risks talk to the size of your carbon footprint. So your greenhouse gas carbon accounting, that element of climate change. And these risks come from the fact that globally, I have to say that quite carefully, but globally, we are largely looking to move towards a low carbon economy. And there will be risks to businesses associated with this. So they break those down into 4 components: policy, technology, market, and reputation. Those are to some extent linked, but an example of a transitional policy risk would be something like climate change. The budget regulations is government requiring you to reduce, and if you aren't able to reduce, that could affect the sustainability of your business. Technology, I love this particular example, is if you were going to lenders or shareholders asking for money to build a new diesel-powered vehicle factory and investing billions in that, knowing that the market is generally moving more towards electric. So that's a very good example of a technology risk, is your business is involved with technology that is likely to become redundant. Market would be similar, as your ability to sell your product based on your carbon footprint, and reputation is even if you do have a low carbon footprint, if you're reporting it, say, scope 1 and 2, but you have scope 1 and 2 is what you control, but you have, for instance, let's talk about coal, a very high scope 3 footprint, and the associated reputational and market risks associated with those. So certainly market and reputation really go closely together, because whether it's the actual ability to market or whether your marketing is being affected by reputation, those are very similar. Okay, so those are transitional risks. And James gave you a bit of insight into CNES, and they will be doing a webinar specifically around greenhouse gases and around options to reduce carbon footprinting and therefore address these risks. On the other side, we have a completely different aspect to climate change. The TCFD and the IFRS call these physical risks. We refer to them as adaptation. It basically means you accept that the climate is going to change no matter what, and that we need to adapt to these changes by trying to understand how this could change for your particular site. This is also where the GISTM, the Global Industry Standard on Tailings Management, focuses almost entirely, because this is, and a lot of insurers are focusing just on transitional risks because they are worried what's going to happen to their investments. Okay. This is separated into 2 components. Acute events, so those are like short-term but almost like natural disaster, although we don't call them natural disasters, natural hazards, flooding, heat waves, droughts, that sort of thing. Whereas you also assess chronic changes, so shifts in rainfall pattern and temperatures, things like sea level rise. The chronic changes, ironically, are less of an issue for mining than the acute events. So when we do a physical risk assessment, most commonly we are focusing on the acute events because that has the biggest potential to impact. Okay, so I called this the how-to guide because really this should help you see where this webinar series is going. Is for transitional risks, we'll have a look at policy, to inform specifically policy risks, quantify greenhouse gases. We'd often benchmark, so we'd try to see how, for instance, your product, your ton of ore, compares to your competition, to see, how you're doing in the market to inform market risks, have a look at some of the technologies, and then look at some options for reduction, and let all of that inform either an impact or a risk assessment methodology as I described. For physical risks, aligned to the GISTM is the first step. Develop a climate baseline, a really solid climate baseline. Look at projected changes, and Justin will be up next with his webinar looking specifically at some of the tools for that, options for design review, and other opportunities to adapt to these climatic changes. So a nice example of that would be projecting changes in design rainfall to inform TSF design and TSF management. Okay. So having said that, we let that kind of structure guide us a little bit. If any of you feel like there's an opportunity to have another aspect, please reach out. So for physical risk, we identified the need for a webinar specifically around tools and approaches to modeling climatic changes. So trying to understand what is available to us to try and crystal ball and understand what could potentially happen. And Justin, he may be on the call today, but Justin is planned to speak. I'm not sure if I've got the date right. I think it's the 26th of February, but it should be the last Thursday of February. In his webinar series, or his webinar, where he'll take you through some of the opportunities there. And then a little bit later, it'll be one of the last ones, looking at how to build resilience. And I'm hoping to get a couple of engineers to come and talk to you really about things like water management, TSF design, and how you can start to consider climate change when you're looking at things like GISTM compliance. All right, and then on transitional risk, a webinar around GHG quantification. Very briefly, we felt that given the South African legislation, you guys probably know how to quantify your carbon footprint. So there's not a need to really focus on that. But with CNES and Carbon Trust in either March or May, we're just trying to see, depending on Ivanhoe's availability, which slot they will take, but for them to come and talk to you about how you can reduce those transitional risks through a couple of innovative ways of reducing your carbon footprint or creating offsets. And then finally, the aspect that underpins it all, I think we're all very comfortable with risk assessment, but we have asked Ivanhoe to come and talk to us a little bit about assessing risk specifically for climate change. So I don't know how I'm doing for time. I think I may have run over a little bit. But yeah, that's a very brief intro to climate change. And the most important thing to remember is just the two components. And it doesn't really matter what you call it, but the one is your impact on the environment, what you're emitting, and the other one is the environment's impact on you. And so how are you at risk from climate change? So thank you very much. I'm going to see if I can keep the Q&A up and still be able to see possibly the chat and the questions. So back over to you, James.
Thanks so much.
If there's any questions.
Thanks so much, Philippa, and yeah, for a really insightful, just almost glimpse into the complex world that is disclosure requirements. I think that you could probably speak for hours on it, and thanks so much for giving us a comprehensive overview. Yeah, so I think it's time now for any questions and answers. If we can open up the floor to questions. I see that there has been one question in the chat from Christian. asking about tools and techniques. Which tools and techniques are used for quantifying greenhouse gas emissions? Christian, maybe do you want to elaborate on your question there in terms of what context are you talking? Not sure if the organizers, if Christian is able to unmute himself.
I will give Christian access. Christian, you do have access to speak.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity for talking to this webinar. I would like just to understand what tools or machines that you are using for quantifying the GHG. Yeah, this is my preoccupation.
But I'm not sure if that's something up your ambit or if it's actually more.
I can talk briefly to it, but I think it's more up your alley, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I can answer that question very briefly. It depends on the purposes of why is it that you're calculating your GHG. So if it's for internal reporting, there are obviously internal tools that you can use and sort of industry benchmarks for a particular process that you can utilize. If it's for a legislative or required reporting point of view, you have to follow the standards set out in the legislation that you are reporting under. So it is a very sort of structured approach, and you follow. It's effectively a toolkit of formulas and emissions factors that you have to apply based on the specific industry and process that you're trying to quantify.
Okay, good. Because you see, in our country, the DRC, there are a lot of companies, most mining companies, but it is a very interesting topic, because we'd like to know maybe regarding the legislation of our government, how we can discuss with some government organization, and it is in that way.
Christian, you touched on my kind of stomping ground. So I do know for the DRC, there's not local legislation that prescribes carbon accounting requirements yet. It is anticipated because they are looking at implementing carbon tax. And if they're going to do carbon tax, they have to tell everybody exactly how to quantify. But at the moment, I don't believe that there is legislation in place. And so for most of the mines I've worked with in the DRC, they're using the greenhouse gas protocol, which is kind of an international best practice guideline to quantify their emissions. And that's where that scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 comes from, is the GHG protocol. And scope 1 means your emissions, so your burning of coal for your boilers, that sort of thing. The DRC luckily has very low scope 2 emissions because of their hydropower. And then they do ask, the GHG protocol does ask that you quantify scope 3, and that basically means emissions that you don't control. And there are some ways in which you can quantify, for instance, things like emissions from contractor logistics, or that sort of thing. So, or a good example of scope 3 would be employee commuting. So the diesel or the energy used to get your employees to site. But yes, so in the DRC, if you were going to start this journey, a good starting point is the greenhouse gas protocol.
I was about to say the exact same thing, Philippa, is that we found that no matter where you look, pretty much everything follows what is said in the GHG protocol. And it's a very robust framework.
Yeah.
The next question is from Belilwa. There seems to be a lot of disclosure requirements and regulation globally and in South Africa. How effective are they if they aren't financially material, like the Carbon Tax Act, for example?
Okay. Bolelwa, so there are a lot of disclosure requirements. Those disclosure requirements are not law, so they don't get enforced. They are enforced. You have to disclose, but that doesn't require you to reduce your carbon footprint. It's more focused on communicating risk to lenders or shareholders. And so I wouldn't call it voluntary, but it's not legislated in a, like, it's not part of South African legislation, as an example. It's in place to protect your shareholders. And it doesn't require you specifically to reduce. Similarly, things like the Carbon Tax Act doesn't require you to reduce, it just requires you to pay. And so none of these compel institutions to reduce their carbon footprint. But they do encourage them, because when you're starting to look at not being able to sell your product because of the carbon footprint, or your shareholders not investing because they think that your mine might get washed away in a flood, then certainly the corporate mining houses are paying a lot of attention to those risks, because it's just good business as part of their strategy. If we talk about legislation specifically reducing carbon footprints, though, the carbon budget regulations, I think, is where you're going to see the real impact, because that's going to specifically require people by law to reduce by a certain amount. And so I think, and while it's not enforced yet, that's going to be your big stick, whereas all the others that have preceded that, the disclosure requirements, the Carbon Tax Act, have been more of a carrot. They've been more of an incentive.
Thanks, Philippa.
Okay.
The next question comes from Gordon. Any comment on the carbon border adjustment mechanism and the impact on exporters to the European Union?
Yes. CBAM at the moment is quite limited in the minerals that it specifies. So I think there's only 11, and I would have to go and look up what those 11 are. So whenever I've assessed risks of CBAM, most commonly, they're not listed in CBAM. However, if you are mining one of those minerals, effectively what the carbon border adjustment mechanism does is it says that if your carbon footprint is higher than the carbon footprint of the same mineral or metal being mined in Europe, that you have to pay the difference in carbon offsets to cover that cost. So basically, you're going to be paying carbon tax like you're in the EU, even if you're not in the EU. So there's going to be a very significant financial risk to mines if they are involved in minerals that are on that list. But I would have to go and look up what that list is. It is quite limited, and it does focus on minerals that are commonly being produced in the EU. So that it was basically just a way to make sure that EU legislation didn't unfairly disadvantage mines in the EU and result in cheap imports coming in with high carbon footprints. So it's a really great mechanism, but to ensure that competition is fair globally. James, I did see a question from Janice, which I'd love to respond to. Sorry, there were a couple that came down later, but Janice was asking about how mine impacts communities, particularly their vulnerability or their ability to adapt to climate change. So if you didn't get it from my bio, adaptation is definitely where I sit. That's the part that gets me excited, and that's the one that is most focused on vulnerability. So I'm going to steal a little bit of Ashley's thunder potentially, because this is a component of risk assessment. We do use very varied risk assessment methodologies, but the EP4 specifically, but the IFC also always requires that we consider vulnerability in that risk assessment. And we've started doing it as pretty standard, is that vulnerability is one of the factors, just like duration, extent, magnitude. We consider vulnerability of the receiving party, environment, community. So when we rate impacts, we'll often rate them differently. So we'd say the risk of flooding and whether that could impact mine infrastructure. So if the TSF fails and it wipes out the mine infrastructure, and we rate that, taking into account that the mine's vulnerability is relatively low. They have insurance and the financial means, equipment, etc., to rebuild. We'll then do the same, but the impact would be, if the TSF fails, what is the impact to the community or the community infrastructure? And then vulnerability is high because a community may not have the means, equipment, etc., just to rebuild houses. It's probably a bad example because the mine would be paying to rebuild the community, but it starts to give you an idea. You know, if you have overflow into a river, as an example, you know, if your return water dam isn't properly sized for future maximum rainfall, you might have uncontrolled discharge and impact water quality. So if the community is using water downstream of your mine, they are extremely vulnerable. And we rate that taking that vulnerability into account. Similarly, we do the same with the environment, is kind of determine the vulnerability of the environment as well. But you spoke specifically about the community. Another aspect where we do look at it is when we look at disasters. We talk about things like community displacement, because while strictly speaking, a mine isn't responsible if a flood displaces a community, most of a mine's employees and service providers are coming from that community. So they have an obligation to those communities to step in. So we often talk about extending disaster management plans to communities. So I hope that talks a little bit. There's not necessarily a specific guideline, but I hope from my experience I've been able to respond to that.
Great. Thanks so much, Philippa. I'm just checking the Q&A in the chat and allowing everybody one last opportunity. If there are any other questions that you'd like to table, let's give everyone just one more minute. If not, we can move on to closing.
While everybody thinks about whether they have one last question, I'll expand with Janice. The other element or the standard with the highest requirement for considering community vulnerability is the GISTM. And I know that is very specific to tailings management, but it has very specific requirements for considering communities and climate change in one set of guidelines. So if you are looking for a standard to reference, specifically talking about community vulnerability, that would be the one. And then I do note there's a similar standard coming out, just looking at general environmental management or sustainability, the consolidated mining standard, which will look at mine operations and not just tailings. But it isn't in force yet.
All right, I don't see any more questions, so I think we will then move to close. Thank you so much, Philippa, for your time and the presentation today. And thank you everyone for attending. Please keep an eye out for the next webinar in the series, which will be happening towards the end of February, covering technology and tools for modeling potential climate impacts. Am I correct, Philippa?
Yes, so Justin will be talking about the tools, specifically how to understand how the climate could change for your site, so that you can make some informed decisions about adaptation measures to implement.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a good day.